welcome to the Backyard Professor videos. It's a beautiful day today. I've got a very interesting subject I want to share with you. One that is extremely instructive, as well as extremely difficult to wrap our minds around. But it's very important to try to. Because truth, if what we're told is true, then it should withhold examination. And I'm proposing to examine something. We're presented with an overflowing amount of information these days. I mean, let's face it, we're in the information age because of the internet and YouTube. And because of the Google search engines and various search engines, we can virtually find access to any kind of information we want. And of course, in whichever cultures we live in, we're constantly being told what to think, what to believe, how to assess our place, as it were, in this universe. I have a very interesting historical example that I want to use as kind of an illustration and show you the difference. I want to illustrate the difference between being told what to think and being told how to think about what to think. And this is a very gut-wrenching historical part of our story in humanity. It's a horrific situation that we've been told what to think about. And so I'm going to begin by sharing this idea with you, and hopefully it'll illustrate the point, the difference, as it were, between what to think and how to think about it. Adolf Hitler, in his madness, in his atheistic, immoral, amoral outlook on life, wiped out 6 million plus people in the course of World War II, completing genocide on the Jewish people. He had no mercy, very little remorse. This evolutionary, atheist-believing, non-believing, disbelieving devil absolutely destroyed millions of lives because of his lack of humanity, his lack of love in his heart. And this horrific Holocaust of so many millions of people is one of the most gruesome aspects of World War II, if not the most gruesome. And we as a humanity can never, ever allow that to happen again. The horror, the shock, the destruction, the wholesale slaughter of mass extinction of so many millions of people is hard for us to wrap our minds around. In fact, we can't. Joseph Stalin was even worse. He wiped out 32 million people in his reign of terror, in his horrifying bloodbath, I'll say. And this atheistic believer in evolution rose because the rest of us didn't have the knowledge. We didn't have the capability, apparently, of stopping this kind of horrific sin against humanity, this horrific slaughter. And if you've ever seen picture history of the Holocaust, it's beyond words. It's absolutely terrifying that someone can do such destruction. And as a species, as a group of people, we can never let something so horrific like this ever happen again. Now, I just told you what to believe. This is a beautiful example of what to believe. It has such a emotional, gut-wrenching impact to explore the Holocaust. It is a horror. All of your emotions of anger and fear and disgust play into this chapter in the story of our lives here on earth. It's a mixture of truth and falsehood, though. So, how do we assess what we are being told every day? That's what I want this video to be about, because we are being told what to think by virtually every source out there. Everybody has a say-so in this exploding world of information. And we as a people are, because of the way we're brought up, and it's the only way we can be brought up, we are always told what to believe. I majored in history. I got a bachelor's in history back in 1994. In the course of learning how to study history, I learned the importance of the primary sources versus the secondary sources. A primary source is going to the original, if at all possible. In our instance of this illustration concerning Hitler, I've told you what I've been told about Hitler from many different places and sources, books, people, my reading, television programs, radio talk shows, etc. The primary sources would be Hitler's own writings. By exploring what Hitler wrote, if he wrote anything, and we're fortunate that he did. His main work is Mein Kampf, which I happen to have a copy of. I went to the library and checked it out. A secondary source is someone else who is telling you their view about Hitler. And they can get things wrong because of misreading information, or believing phony information, or because of their bias. Their bias will stop them, and all of us have this. None of us are immune from this, I'm telling you what. It's the way the mind works. We have biases. Whether we're conscious or unconscious of them is irrelevant, and those biases direct our lives. So I went and got Hitler's main source to see what is the ideology. What caused him to have such an outlook in life? And this is the only way we can find out from him himself, instead of simply believing everything we're told. So in Mein Kampf, he's talking about his childhood and upbringing and trying to figure out what he wants to do in life, and the friends he had, and the very difficult time he had with his father, who wanted him to be a civil servant, and he said, "Nothing doing, I don't want to do that." But he had some wonderful times in his childhood, and when he wrote Mein Kampf as sort of a looking back on his childhood and upbringing, he said on page 8, "I thank heaven that a portion of the memories of those happy days still remains with me." This is not the talk of an atheist. This is not how an atheist talks at all. And in reading various studies of the Holocaust and different approaches to trying to assess how this possibly could have happened right beneath our noses, Hitler hid the truth in plain sight in his book Mein Kampf. He described what he was going to do, and we all read it and we didn't believe it. We couldn't believe someone was that mad, was that absolute insanely crazy, and yet he was. And he describes in his book who influenced him the most. And it's an absolute shock when we read Hitler's view. We've been told by various Christian scholars, by various historians, many different views of Hitler's basis for his insane hate. Hitler himself told whom he admired the most. Isn't it fascinating that this atheist, this man who used social Darwinism, evolution, as an excuse to wipe out lower species in his view, isn't it odd that not once in Mein Kampf does he ever bring up evolution or Darwin? That wasn't the basis of his ideology. But he does mention who was. On page 213, he says, "The great statesmen whom I admire, but also the great reformers of society, the great reformers of religion." And he mentions, beside Frederick the Great stands Martin Luther, as well as Richard Wagner. And he says on the next page, on 214, as he's describing the fact that the bourgeois politicians no longer laugh at us because we're taking things into our own hands and we have the power to control our destiny. His ideology is, what we must fight for is to safeguard the existence and the reproduction of our race and our people, the sustenance of our children and the purity of our blood, the freedom and independence of the fatherland, so that the people may mature for the fulfillment of the mission allotted to it by the Creator of the universe. This is not the talk of an atheist. This is the talk of a religious man. Horrific as his actions and life was, though, to say it was because he was an atheist who believed in evolution is simply false. We have his own writings on who influenced him and what his ideology was. He talks later in Mein Kampf and throughout Mein Kampf, periodically every now and then, he mentions an idea on page 312. He says, oh, this is the edition of Mein Kampf translated by Ralph Mannheim. It's a Mariner book from Hoffen Miffen, and it's a 1999 reprint. He says on page 312, race, however, does not lie in the language. He's talking about his theory of race, but exclusively in the blood, which no one knows better than the Jew, who attaches very little importance to the preservation of his language, but it's all important for him to preserve the purity of his blood. This idea of blood I'll bring out later when we explore another analysis. But that seemed to have been one of Hitler's themes and ideas. He didn't want the German blood, the Aryan blood, to be mixed with the Jewish blood. He also wanted to keep the blood of his people pure. That was a major concern of Hitler's. On page 562, we read, the folkish-minded man, in particular, has the sacred duty, each in his own denomination, of making people stop just talking superficially about God's will, and actually fulfill God's will, and not let God's word be desecrated. He's calling for action of the people of God to take seriously what he understood the Bible to be saying, and instead of just talking about God's will, it's time to perform God's will. This is not the talk of an atheistic evolutionist. This is the talk of a religious man. Finally, on page 667, it's necessary, therefore, that the National Socialist movement be recognized and established in the eyes of all as the champion of a definite political purpose. Whatever heaven may have in store for us, let men recognize us by our very visor. He believed he was working under the mandate of heaven. Hector Avalos, who teaches religious studies at Iowa State University, has a chapter, Atheism Was Not the Cause of the Holocaust, in the book The Christian Delusion, Why Faith Fails, edited by John W. Loftus. He describes these ideas on Hitler and how, this is on page 372, this book was published in 2010 by Prometheus Books. Nazism is part of a long history of Christian anti-Judaism. Nazism does not represent a radical departure from traditional Christian attitudes towards Jews. There is little question that the Holocaust had its origin in the centuries-long hostility felt by Christians against the Jews. Nazism is simply an updated form of Christian anti-Judaism. On page 373, he says, every single point in Martin Luther's plan was implemented by Nazi policy. And he describes Martin Luther's plan against the Jews himself, and he had 7 main points that he advocated getting rid of the Jews out of Europe. And on every one of those points, Hitler utilized those points. It was an extension of Christian tradition, is what Hitler was operating under. On page 376, he says, nothing Hitler said disproves that he believed he was doing God's will. That was his ideology. He was going to conclude the problem of the Jews that Jesus began in the New Testament. He was going to conclude the all-out war against the Jews. He says on page 382, we find a number of places in Mein Kampf where Hitler, no less than Martin Luther, claimed to be following the will of God in cleansing the earth from evil. In their warped thinking, the Jews were that evil. Hitler's alleged goal is a better religion, a true religion. He wasn't advocating no religion. He was advocating a better one. And the astonishing thing about Hitler is he makes a difference between not believing in Christianity and not believing in God is not the issue. It wasn't because he didn't believe in God or didn't think Christianity was right that caused him to do what he did. It wasn't an anti-Christian bias. It was a completely Christian program as the basis for his ideological cleansing of the earth from bad blood to keep the blood of his people pure. It was done in the name of God and religion, not Darwin, an evolutionistic atheism. That's sometimes hard to swallow, but all the evidence is in Mein Kampf and in careful analysis of the sources of Hitler. And on page 387, Avalos notes, if we look at Hitler's own racist rationales, we find that he appeals to the Bible, not to the origin of species. Again, Hitler's notion that blood desecration is a sin down to the 10th generation is not in Darwin's works, but it is found in Deuteronomy 23, 2 and 3. And where do we find the notion that race mixing is a sin? That's nowhere in Darwin's books, but it is found in Ezra 9, 1 through 2 and verse 12. Mein Kampf indicates that it is the Bible, not Darwin's book on the origin of species, that seems to be the more direct influence for Hitler. He notes on page 389, Hitler makes clear that being against Christianity is not the same as being against belief in God. Both theistic and non-theistic morality can result in genocide. Any difference in the number of deaths is more of an accident of history than a difference in a principle that can justify the killing of groups based on ethnicity, race, nationality, or religion. Then he outlines on page 390 Hitler's policies, and he compares where we find these policies. The burning of Jewish synagogues. It's found in Luther, but it's not found in Darwin. The idea of destroying Jewish homes. Again, it's found in Luther, but not in Charles Darwin. Destroying sacred Jewish books. Forbidding rabbis to teach. Abolishing safe conduct. Confiscating Jewish property. Forcing Jews into labor. Citing God as part of the reason for anti-Judaism. All of this is found in Luther's writings, and none of it is found in Charles Darwin's writings. The Germans wouldn't have been near as familiar with Darwin's books as they were with the Bible and the continuing Christian anti-Judaistic bias and hate and envy and fear and mistrust and misogyny. It is an ugly picture, but that's what makes the lesson so powerful, is we can't allow a religious basis for our hate anymore. We can't allow this idea that one group of humans are especially privileged while all the others need to be exterminated. That is not Charles Darwin's evolutionary viewpoint. That does come from the Bible and religious interpretation of the Bible. And it has caused bloodshed and war and hate for millennia. We need to find the courage, the fortitude, the morality, and the willpower to change that kind of sad, miserable thinking. This is how to think through ideas. So thanks for watching my videos, and I'll see you in the next videos. And as I usually say, have a great life. In fact, have a well-informed great life is even the better way to put it.